Okay, I guess we'll get started. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody, where you might be in the world. Welcome to this FlavorWiki webinar entitled Branded or Blinded, When, Why, and Why Does It Matter? So today we're going to be digging into some topics that is really interesting for us as a company because we get a lot of these questions around when a project should be done branded or blinded, meaning blind, the brand is removed, it's just the product, the consumer doesn't understand that there's a brand there, or is it should be branded where they understand who has produced it and from when. I'm joined by Marcia Young and Ellie Alexandraki from the FlavorWiki team, which we'll introduce in a few moments, and let's get started. So the session's going to be broken down into three main topics. It'll take about 45 to 50 minutes, we hope, to get through, and then we'll have some time for questions. First, we're going to go through a little bit about FlavorWiki and what we do, which is in particular puts us in a position to evaluate the effects of brand impact on product testing. And then we're really going to get into some of the core areas about what are the differences between a blind or branded study and what is really important to consider whether or not you should do one blinded or branded. And that'll include some cases, some specific cases where we showed some information that's been sanitized and kind of brands taken out and things like this, but nevertheless is really good a representation of what you can expect in differences between blind and branded. And then we'll talk a little bit about how our projects work in these typical type of branded case studies. Next slide. So just before we start, maybe we'll introduce the three of us. My name is Daniel Protz. I'm the founder and CEO. I've been running FlavorWiki since we started in 2018. My background is mostly in finance and data science, based in Zurich, Switzerland, and manage the team from here. Marcia and Ellie, do you want to introduce yourselves?
Sure. Marcia Young. I'm a senior advisor with FlavorWiki. I retired from Mondelez International in 2020, where I was their global head of consumer science. But I spent my career 40 plus years in the food industry, always in R&D, managing sensory and consumer science functions globally for multiple companies, as you can see on the slide. So happy to be here.
Thanks.
Hi, and this is Ed Alexandraki. So I'm sensory and consumer scientist at FlavorWiki. My studies were in sensory science from Wageningen University a few years ago now, and then I worked for a few years as a sensory as a panel manager and as a sensory manager in different industries and as a consultant. And at FlavorWiki, I'm supporting the study designs and our market research projects as well as execution.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, so just a little bit of background about FlavorWiki. We have been doing product and market testing since 2018. We do both blinded and branded studies. So we started our existence doing mostly branded studies of consumers buying products in the market and doing it in home and in context. And that's still a lot of what we do. But we've had the opportunity to do projects both blinded and branded, and many times the same project blinded and branded for different reasons. We've also had the opportunity to see different country settings. We work in over 50 countries now for commercial projects, and we're growing our consumer community around the world, pretty much in every country where there's mobile devices. Most of our projects are done for multinationals, which is also very interesting because we are able to see the same product and test the same product in different markets, and also see the impact of brand, brand influence in projects, which can vary also by market. So next slide. We tend to consider the entire we call consumer journey experience. So we focus a lot on sensory and a lot on the food. And I think when we're talking about blind testing, we're really talking about things that are just above the surface of the water in this iceberg image that we have here. So we're limited then when we're doing blind testing to things about sensory attributes, understanding that, as well as hedonic insights and potentially the expectation of the product. But of course, then there's a lot of other things that go on in a product experience and a product purchase decision, which include things like shopping, packaging, value for money, price, use case, etc. And so we try to consider all of these types of things. As you'll see in the discussion, there are some cases where blinded and looking only at that area above the water, that area of the iceberg above the water makes sense. But in many cases, then you miss out on some very important learnings otherwise. Next slide. Our missions, if you will, in the branded case. So when we talk about branded, we usually talk about something that's in context, meaning that the consumer goes out and sees the brand in the store and on the package. They see how the brand presents themselves on the shelf. They see all the advertising imagery and etc. And so they're really going out and going on a mission to purchase it. They may be evaluating it at the store shelf and collecting information there. And then, of course, they're taking it home or taking it to wherever they may use the product and they're consuming it. And that's the real, product, food or liquid evaluation. And then finally, of course, we're evaluating that. We have a special methodology for doing the descriptive attributes analysis in these settings, which I'll talk about in a moment. But when we talk about branded, this is really the kind of procedure we talk about. When we talk about blinded, we speak about either doing it in home, meaning that we ship a blinded product to the client or to the consumer, or in a traditional CLT, which I'm sure most people are very familiar with, in which case then the product can be presented without any identifying features at all. Next. Most of what we do is in context. We'll talk a lot about how when doing branded tests, you can get this contextual information, and that has an influence on the product evaluation, not just the brand. And we talk about branded, but doing something branded really brings in a lot of things other than just, is it made by brand X? It also brings in how does the product come in the packaging? How easy is it to open? How easy and functional is it to use in the setting that I want to use it in, like going to the gym or having a snack at work? And so branded brings a lot of these contextual aspects into the study, which can be beneficial, but also, as we'll see, we need to be careful about how that influences the evaluation of the actual food or liquid. Next slide. We work all over the world, so we're able to do this in many different places. And of course, brand has different impact in different countries, right? The brand value and brand perception, and also the other things that the brand brings with it, like sustainability claims and packaging and ingredient claims, all that varies by market. So many of these cases we'll see really need to be considered on a market by market basis. That is a key consideration. Next. So one of the main things about doing a test of a food or beverage is the evaluation of the descriptive component. And we have developed a patented methodology for doing this descriptive component where we can give this to consumers. We can give it to panelists in a blind setting, of course, but we can also have consumers do this descriptive profiling when they're out in the world doing it in a branded context. And it works pretty simply. We give different sensory attribute pairings and have them compare attributes within a particular modality frame. And then we use a machine algorithm and mathematics to take those various binomial votes and turn them into a profile. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but this is one thing I think when we do branded testing that really brings some additional light into the procedure. Next. That's not to say that sensory and blind are not a great part of market research, or that there's a one or the other. There are different case settings that make sense for using different methodologies, as we'll see. The ideal situation always is to be able to have both blind analysis and contextual branded analysis, because then we're able to really understand what is the impact quantitatively of the brand. And you'll see that there's a couple of examples that we're able to show and talk about where we've actually done these types of tests in both blinded and branded settings where we're able to quantify that. Next slide. So the big question of like, why would one do it branded? Why wouldn't one do it blinded? And why does that matter? And why is it important? So next. And here I know that we have some people here today that have a lot more experience than myself in the actual commercial food industry, Marcia in particular. But this is a kind of a constant debate. We see within the client groups that we work for that there's many different opinions about why should a test be done blinded or branded. What is the value of each? And maybe we just take a few minutes to talk about what's the reason for that? Is it really one that's better than the other, or are there some other extenuating circumstances? So, Marcia, maybe you want to give us a little bit of
Sure.
background on experiences you've had.
Sure. So I'm sure many of you have had similar discussions over the years. I know I've had many with regards to blind and branded. And there's a history, particularly in the packaged food industry, where R&D has been their remit or responsibility has been to do blind product testing. You're R&D, you're going to do the research. We are using experimental designs, and we're also trying to limit the variability or the variables that we're testing, and using designs of experiments and so forth, and we want that to be blind. And that has been kind of the remit for the R&D teams, where on the marketing research, consumer insights side, they tend to test fewer products. They're branded. They're looking at the entire proposition in terms of price and package, and maybe even advertising or concept testing and so forth. So there's always this tension of when a product tests well on a blind basis and then doesn't do well in a branded basis, or one type of test is a CLT and one is a HUT, and they don't match up perfectly. Where is the disconnect, and how do we get to that disconnect and find out whether or not the brand is actually having an impact? Is it the price that's having an impact, package, those kinds of things? So there are always these things to consider, and in some cases with products it's much easier to blind if you need to do that than others. So particularly if you have a particular shape, or you have an embossing on your product, or in some cases you can't unpackage and repackage your competitor's product without changing it. And so that also presents a conundrum of how do you get the best evaluation that you can, whether you need to do it blind or branded. And I think what we're going to present to you here is some examples that show you that, in fact, you can use branded testing in applications that you may not have thought of previously.
Thanks. Next slide. So we sort of broke this problem down into 5 areas of consideration. When we talk to customers and they are considering how to test a product, sometimes they don't really have a great idea about what execution they should use. They have an idea of what they want to learn, and it can be important to evaluate, why one versus the other. So there's kind of 5 main areas we think about. One is, what do you want to learn about the actual overall product experience? Is that important? Is it important to have information about price, package, use case, etc., or is it really just the product that we want to evaluate? The other thing then is, what aspects of the product evaluation do you want to get at? Are there very specific discrimination that you need to do? Like, is it really important that only the product be evaluated? So that's one area, and we'll talk about some examples there. And then finally, there's what are basically recruitment considerations. We'll see that the execution of a blind test is different from just a operational point of view than a branded test needs to be. And sometimes doing it branded can open up some different opportunities, and sometimes doing it in a location can also open up opportunities or challenges. Then we talk about data interpretation. How do you take conclusions away from a branded versus a blinded study? And then finally, what are the differences in timing of execution and the cost of doing some of these projects? Next. So first is product experience. I'll speak a little bit about this, and then we'll pass it over to the rest of the team. So when you're talking about product experience, for what we mean by product experience is the overall experience you have with the product. And that's everything. That's not just consuming it, but it means every part of acquiring it, buying it, dealing with the package, whether or not your friends think it's cool that you use one product versus another, anything that can go into what you deal with. So in a blinded test, you really have the capability to focus on just the sensory attributes of the product. There's a limitation. There is no brand associated to it. There is no experience of buying it. There is no package. We're really only looking at what is the taste, texture, and actual food performance. So that's a more limited scope. And if that's the reason why to do a test, and that's the real reason, the learning goal, then perhaps that's the better option to go with, right? However, the other thing to really understand is that when you're doing a consumer evaluation in a blinded setting, that is almost certainly not the setting that they would be using the product in real life, right? So although they are not influenced by things that are not related to the food, most likely nobody is going to buy your product without understanding the brand and buying it. So that's not very representative of what they really do in real life. Again, I think back to what Marcia said, what is this internal kind of a debate? Is it just the product that matters, and is that the remit, or are there other elements that are being considered? In a branded study, you really have a much more holistic capability to understand more information. More information means that there is potentially a little bit more noise in different areas of that. We have to look at how we evaluate the data, but definitely you can get a broader understanding of it. And it really is representative of what the consumer goes through in their real life purchase decision. Next. So this is a small case. For us, it was a very interesting case because it utilized both branded testing and blinded testing. So the branded testing was done using products that could be purchased in the store. So we started out understanding what is the consumer's experience across several different competing products in the market. They went out, they bought it, they evaluated it in the store, they took it home, they used it. And from that, of course, we were able to understand much more about all those products and the whole product experience. But we also understood a lot more about the consumers themselves and how they reacted to those products in the store setting. That was a fantastic outcome for the learning goals. It was done in a sequential monadic case, not necessarily how a consumer would evaluate those products or use those products in real life, but doing it sequentially monadic allows for a better comparison between them. And this was done in Mexico. And then the nice thing about this is that we were able to get a real understanding of what drives preference in the product experience, overall product experience from the purchase. But then afterwards, we shipped additional blinded samples to the home of the consumer, some of which included blinded product that they had tasted that was in the store, and others that were products that were not available in the market already. And so by doing that, we were able to then really make sure that we understood the preference drivers of the actual food, one versus another, as well as what we understood from the preference drivers of the food in the branded setting. And in this particular case, the two matched up very well, and we saw very limited brand impact from the branded study. We have more examples of that, but I think this is kind of a perfect case, which is that we get a lot of scope of understanding of the consumer and the product, but then we're also able to get a deep understanding of the food competitiveness. Next, Mars. And just to use a kind of an example, on the left-hand side, we see a profile that was created using our paired question methodology. So this is consumers tasting products in the market from the store, doing the paired response and getting a sensoric descriptive profile of it. And then on the right-hand side, we see an actual train panel data. And so what's interesting here is to see, number one, the similarity that we get between the train panel and the train panel data and the data that's created by the consumer, but also note that there are some differences. So some of the attributes, like, for example, richness is more pronounced when it comes to evaluation from the train panel, and that's not as perceived by the consumer. And I think this is important because really the consumer's experience is what is critical, right? Like, how do they perceive the product and what's going on in their mind and their psyche? Sometimes blind train panel data is really best for analysis of product differences. So here we see on the left-hand side product differences in the mind of the consumer, and the right-hand side product differences in the mind of the panel, which is, like, shall we say, more analytical. Any other comments you want to make on that, Marcia or Ellie? But I think this was a very interesting case that combined both the blind and a branded component. And we see here that actually the sensory experience is not that influenced by the brand, at least.
Yeah, just to note that there were a couple of key attributes where, in particular, the consumers discriminated at a greater degree than what was found with the in-house trained panel, particularly in bitter and the richness, where the products separated more greatly. And to remember, when we're doing this work with the consumers, your N was 200 versus what you have with the trained panel. So with the consumers, you're going to have limited amounts of attributes because you're not going to have the full 30 attributes of the trained panel. But the attributes that you are testing, you do have a lot of power to pull out and discriminate on those samples with the patented technology.
Yeah, good point. Thank you. Okay, moving on then. Okay, next, product evaluation. So I think Marcia and Ellie are going to speak a little bit about another case that really deals with evaluating product blinded versus branded.
Okay. So let me just start with, in terms of the blinded approach. And I had mentioned this earlier, that some products are just impossible or impractical to do blind. And in fact, when you're doing that, if you're doing that in a CLT environment, then you also have, you're missing out on the contextual aspect of the product. And on the branded front, the brand sometimes can, and it's part of that discussion that you go back and forth on is, what is that impact of that brand, and is it impacting results? And maybe when it's blind, it doesn't perform well against the competition, but the minute you brand it, that halo effect comes into play, and now your product is perceived better than the competition. And then you have to wrestle with, but what does that do in the marketplace? Are you actually losing share to that competition? And yet you test it, head to head, and your branded product is winning. So it's still that conundrum that you're trying to work through of what it is about the entire product experience that is impacting the consumer. And when you can also test it in that natural moment of consumption, this can truly help to identify some of those issues. Next slide.
Great.
Okay. Ellie, do you want to go through this?
Yes, sure.
Okay.
Okay, so this is a case study that we evaluated different fruit drinks. It was a benchmarking, so those products were already available in the market, but what we wanted to examine is like, okay, we wanted to examine only the taste of them and take out any brand effect. So we did a blinded CLT in a sequential monadic way. So consumers would taste the different products, one after the other, of course, in a randomized way. But also we wanted to examine the brand effect. So what is the brand effect overall in the overall product experience? But also, is there a brand effect regarding the taste of the product? Does even the brand affect the taste of it? So we did both again. So we did a blinded CLT, and we also did a branded in-home use test. So, and this was done monadically. So consumers would go, separate consumers, and buy and evaluate each product separately, and evaluate like the full experience from the store till consumption, and like expectations, outcome, etc. So if we see the results, we got some very interesting results regarding that. If we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, great. So just to also give you an introduction, in this one, we also had QDA panel data. So we had the evaluation of the product profiles from a trained panel, but also we asked consumers to evaluate the products using the PERT question technique that Daniel presented earlier. So first thing that we saw is that, again, in this study, consumers were able to identify product differences on a higher magnitude compared to the trained panel. What does that mean? It means that we have better feedback in terms of execution and in terms if we need to change something in the products, for example. So in terms of the comparison between blinded and branded, what was the most important thing here is that we saw that consumers evaluated the products in a similar way. So the trends were similar. Like, for example, if you see freshness, the product with the higher with the highest freshness on the CLT in the blinded, it was also the higher in the branded, and like it followed the same trend. And this was also like the same trend in terms of positive attributes, but also more, if we can say, negative, like bitterness or metallic. Depending on the project, of course, we say if something is positive or negative. Yes, so here what we could say that is that in terms of taste, if you want to evaluate your product's taste, either you do it blinded or branded, it's very likely that you're going to get good feedback, valuable results. And then the question is, okay, if the product is already on the shelf, do you also want to see the overall product experience or not? Yeah, so Marcia, I don't know if you would like to add anything here.
Yeah, and going through and really looking at this data when it was received, the interesting thing for me was that there were some shifts from blind to branded, but that was consistent across the products. So some of the more positive attributes tended to be a little higher when it was branded, and those things you might consider, you know, negative were a little less when it was branded, but all 5 products reacted in a similar way. So there wasn't that, you know, one product when it was branded shifted differently than the other. So I thought that was really telling. And then just to go back to say here in this case, of course, their trained panel in this case had a lot other information that they were using in attributes, but that we were using a subset of those in this situation. And that, again, the consumers were able to differentiate the samples in a similar way.
Great. So next is recruitment considerations. As we mentioned before, if we're doing something blinded, we're either shipping or going to a CLT. And if we're doing something branded, we can send the consumer basically anywhere that the product may already be. So why don't we can go to the next slide, and I'll give an example of what are the kind of like some real positives about doing this in branded versus blinded. So in a blinded test, you have to ship it or you have to have a CLT. In a CLT case, usually a consumer is only willing to travel, let's say 10 miles or maybe 20 kilometers, 25 kilometers from their home to the testing center. So you're limited to whatever the demographic is that's available in that location. And then, of course, there's a small percentage, you know, usually less than 5% of the population who's willing to come to that location and do that test. So there's 2 things that happen here, which can be, which are important considerations, and we consider them sometimes negative, but depending upon your use case. One is you tend to sort of recruit into that geographic of that radius, and then you exhaust the willingness of each additional consumer to come to the center, meaning that your list is static. Yes, people move in and out of the region. Yes, you reach people that maybe you've never reached before. But as over time, if the CLT has been there for 10 or 15 years, they're typically dealing with a pretty static group of people. So these people tend to be doing tests pretty often. And that creates a couple of important biases. One is they test a lot of products, so they're not really a naive consumer. The other thing is that we've seen when we do CLT execution and then sometimes the same product in a in-home shipping, because that consumer is really accustomed to testing and because it's important for them to come to the CLT and do that, they're making money to doing it. They tend to be a little bit more they rate products higher, right? So they're a little bit nicer. This is just a psychological issue than the people that are getting the product or maybe doing a consumer test for the very first time in their home. So that's one consideration when you're doing a blinded test. Now, there are ways to do blinded test shipping products. We do it quite often. There, of course, you deal with some limitations in terms of things like shipping frozen product can be done. We do it, but things like testing in-home blinded ice cream, these are the things that I think that there are just limitations around doing that. And so you have this risk of professional testers when you do a blinded test. Again, if we just care about really evaluating product A versus product B or prototype A versus prototype B, this can be just fine and it may be more appropriate. In the branded case, we really can go anywhere, right? Like we can anywhere that somebody can acquire a product, and many products have very wide distribution. We can send consumers there. We can send them to quick service restaurant locations. And I think I see a question in the chat as well about prototypes in store. We can send consumers to specific stores. And we've had cases where a client will have a very limited production run and they will put maybe just 1 month worth of supply in 5 or 6 stores in a particular city. We can send those consumers there to acquire that product in that situation. So you basically just have a much bigger catchment of individuals. Next slide. And this can be important geographically. We like to use the example of France. In France, a really large portion of the population is concentrated in Paris and Marseille and 1 or 2 other urban areas. And most testing locations, therefore, are in the urban areas. But it's a very diverse country. Tastes are very different from Brittany to the south of France. And so, therefore, you're not necessarily capturing all dimensions of the market. Whereas if you're willing to do something branded, then you can send consumers out into the various stores in their region, and you can get a much better assessment of those different subcategories of users. Next slide. Marcia, I think this is up. You're up on this one.
Yes, or Ellie, jump in as well. So in the fruit drinks case, we were also, we had the CLT versus a branded in-home. And of course, in the CLT, we're in, 4 different regions, and we had to try to get all of the same date code in order to, keep everything consistent. I think we did that. I think there might have been one where we had, 2 date codes that we had to use. But in the branded study where people are going out into larger areas and picking product up in the market, we evaluated those across all of those date codes, and in this case found that some of the products had varying degrees of consumer liking across the entire panel based on the date code. So you wouldn't have captured that necessarily in the CLT. And this is just one example. We saw multiples of these. We saw some of the products that were quite consistent across date codes, and we saw some products that varied quite a bit across date codes. So you can see here that there was a mean score of 6.9 for the product in total, and yet there was quite a bit of variability based on date codes. And you weren't able to capture that necessarily in the CLT.
Yeah. It's also a very interesting way if you want to examine consistent product quality. So if you have a large number of consumers and you track all the different date codes, overall trend in the liking scores, you see if the product remains sort of like of a consistent quality, or if there is a big variation on the quality. So there are different types of information you can retrieve from that.
Yeah. And you might have, you might look at this and say, well, yeah, that's not so bad. But there were some products in this study that were very tight around its mean in terms of its product quality and the liking. That was much more consistent than this. So this was able to show some variation across those date codes.
Thanks. Next slide. All right, so data interpretation. I think this is one of the main debates we hear around branded versus blinded is, are you getting a real assessment? And then how do you deal with the brand impact? How do you parse that out? How do you know if it's there? How do you know what the magnitude is of it? So we'll take a look at a couple of examples of kind of head-to-head comparisons we've made. Marcia or Ellie, do you want to go ahead on this?
Sure. So in the blinded work, the preference ratings, the action, we work with the clients in terms of the action standards, but it's typically an overall liking or a preference measure that they're using. In some cases, you might have a particular attribute as an action standard, but most of the time you're looking at an overall liking or a significant difference from one product to another. And you have a specific set of samples and you're looking at, particular variables or test variables that you're investigating. On the branded side, you could have multiple action standards, not just around, your KPI on an overall liking, but you might have some other things that you can consider in terms of ease of opening or, how it performs at the shelf, maybe even preparation. We've seen some clients that we've worked with wanting to actually have consumers prepare the product and evaluate that in an in-home situation, which we're able to evaluate as well. So you can get just a more broader set of KPIs when you're doing a branded study. Next slide. Okay, so here's a situation that it was a head-to-head comparison of a blind versus branded. And we had 200 consumers. So one group was asked to buy the product in the store, and the other group had products shipped to their home. And we had, of course, the distribution of half did product one first and half did product two.
And the product shipped to the home was the brand was removed, basically.
Correct.
Right? Yeah.
Yep. Yep. So it was the same product, just one was sent blind and to the home, and the other they purchased in the store. Okay. And in terms of the results of that, again, there was very little variation between blind and branded in this case. The product, one was seen as significantly higher in both of those situations. The top three box on liking scores were very similar. And we found that in this case, that we didn't have a brand impact. Okay. So that was pretty straightforward. Was interesting since they had gotten the exact same products. One they went and bought in the store, and the other they were shipped to home.
Yeah, and I think that you'd agree, right, Marcia, is that you never know what the brand impact is going to be because it is specific by category, meaning like what is the category leader in that product, and usually there's a category leader 1 and 2 in a particular category in a country, and then of course the country matters, right? Because the key competitor might be a stronger or less strong brand based on that situation. So if you are running an international brand where it's, present in every country and you want to drive consistency across all of those different countries, you may be competing with different local competitors in different regions, right? And so the question is like, well, how do we kind of like set an action standard for our benchmark or for our competitive test where it's done branded, where we don't know what the influence of the brand test is? And we've seen that this is kind of the core of the discussion that happens internally when the question of doing blind versus brand comes up. And we have come up with a solution for this. We can go to the next slide. Usually in kind of what we call compliance or competitive testing, there's a need or there's an advantage to doing this on a regular base. And unfortunately, many companies and brands do this pretty infrequently, partially because of the cost related to doing all the blinding and things like that. But by doing this more frequently, we can actually look at any sort of longitudinal changes. So what we've devised and what we've done by, again, doing many of these cases where it's both blind and branded, we've said, well, look, we're going to go through the first step. In the first stage, we will do a test. One is branded, and then the exact same duplicate being blinded, just like what Marcia showed you in the output in the last slide. And we do that for each country, each category, right? So if we're doing a program like this, we'll do that in a single case. Usually we'll ship the product blinded because that's also a little more cost effective. And then we'll be able to define the action standard, because then we can really quantify the differences in the rating, in the score. Almost always, and I think there's never been a case we've seen where the winning product has been different in a branded versus a blinded case. It's just the magnitude of by how much a product wins or is preferred. I think Marcia mentioned you have like positive attributes or winning products that win by more, or attributes that influence by more in the branded case. But it's never reversing the kind of the order of preference. And so what we do is we do what we call a gold standard definition, meaning what is the gold standard? In a lot of cases, the client may even come up with a product that's not sourced in the store. It's actually sourced from the factory. So we know that it is kind of the perfect product. And then we'll use that then as a way of normalizing the results we get from future branded tests of the competitor versus the core product that we're benchmarking against. And normally then the follow-on tests are smaller. They're pretty simple to set up and deploy. We can collect just 100 or 150 or sometimes even 50 responses. And because we've done already all of the evaluation and work to set up the test, they're very quick to implement. And then we just get back the data and we can normalize it based on the first blinded versus branded test that we're doing. Over time, this allows for this benchmarking or compliance testing to be a lot faster, more cost effective, and can be done more frequently, which helps companies stay on top of their competitiveness. Any other points on that, Marcia, you can think of?
No, I think you covered it.
Okay. Next slide, then. Keep moving here. We've got 15 minutes left. Okay, last point, right? Is project cost and timing. So I'm going to ask Ellie to speak a little bit about the timing, but I'll speak about the cost because it's pretty clear the differences. If you can go to the next slide. Blinded tests, particularly in CLTs, require quite a bit of logistics, product handling, and they take time. It is true that you can do a CLT test pretty quickly, but oftentimes if the CLT is booked, you have to anticipate that calendar, right? And it can be expensive to do so. We have to compensate the consumer in order to get them into this facility, right? Which is the cost of fuel, which is going up all the time, and then of course the cost of the incentive. In a branded case, this can be done very quickly because it really can be done as quickly as the consumer can, open up their phone and go to the store, right? So it's much faster, and it also tends to be much more cost effective because we don't have to compensate the consumer as much. We usually give them a free product, meaning that they'll earn cash after they finish. They'll get the value of the product back. But the other thing is that it drives a little bit more authentic engagement because there is no way for the consumer to make additional cash they have to buy the product, but then they just get the same amount of money back. Whereas incentivizing people to come to a location to do that blind test and to sit in that room, and it's not a very natural setting, it naturally attracts people that are interested in earning some money. So there is a little bit of bias that's introduced. Next. And there's, at least in the cases that we deal with, we see oftentimes a very large difference in pricing, particularly when dealing with monadic tests. As Marcia mentioned, and as Ellie said before, monadic tests can be very expensive if you do just one consumer per product. So again, in a CLT setting or even a shipping setting, because you have a cost of logistics to ship the product, you typically end for cost reasons, you end up going with a sequential monadic or incomplete block design. And that makes the data less reusable. Whereas in monadic testing, you can actually compare the score of a product in 1 year versus the score of a product in the next year. It's more it's more statistically correct to do that. And so we have an impact of the cost, meaning that if we do a branded test, particularly monadically, it can be 30 or 40% of the price of a CLT. So there is a cost consideration there too, and also an execution time. Now, execution time always varies. This is why I'm going to ask Ellie to chime in here, because she's running projects. And the field work, of course, is one thing, but then there's the other elements of designing the study and doing the reporting, which vary, of course, based on the amount of data. But we do tend to see that the branded studies can be deployed and the data can be back quicker than most other execution methods. And Ellie, if you have something to add there in your experience of doing both CLTs and now doing quite a few in-home tests with FlavorWiki, I'm not sure if you can elaborate.
Yeah, sure. There is a great difference here. So when we want to do a CLT, the planning starts week ahead to book the location, to recruit the consumers, all the organization takes usually 8 to 12 weeks. Sometimes even more, because you also need to coordinate with the client, and it can be time consuming. For some people that's okay, and that's okay for us as well. But when you want things faster, usually an in-home use test that you will either ship the products to the consumers, or if the products are available in the market, to do a branded, sending the consumers out in the stores, it's much faster. So one by one, in cases that we ship the products to the consumer, so usually this involves some of repacking, either from the client or ourselves, if we want to do it blind, or we can even do it branded and ship the products to the consumer, but usually that's not of high benefit. That usually would take 4 to 5 weeks, so much less than compared to the CLT. So then, and if we do branded, sending the consumers out in the store, buy the product and evaluate it, this usually it's very fast. We create the study design, we create our questionnaires and our methodologies, however, depending on the objectives, and after coding the survey, consumers are out in the store. So in terms of timings, this is the most quick one. But of course, it really depends on the objectives, but timing is something that you probably would like to take into account.
Yeah, and I can just add on to that. We've kind of talked here in terms of having products, going out to a market and buying products and bringing it home for a home use test. There are guardrails that are used when we're doing the in-home work to make sure, in fact, that, we see receipts, pictures of receipts, we see them with the product, we know who these consumers are because they're part of our community. So there are a lot of controls there to ensure that the products are being used in the appropriate manner and that they are the right products. But the other thing is, there are situations, and we have them with some clients where it's a quick serve restaurant or it's a convenience store, and you want the consumer to actually go out to a particular restaurant or quick serve and buy a particular product and then use it in that normal environment. Or it's a product that is, something that would only be used in home. So like a personal care product, hair removals, deodorants, those kinds of things, where you can also get a much better evaluation in an in-home environment than you can in the CLT, but you can also then add on that brand impact to understand one product versus another.
Yeah. Yeah, and Marcia, let's also not forget things that take place over weeks and months, right? Like using a product where you have to reuse it, like a shampoo or something like that, typically food is consumed, but other products that are, of course, in the space in which we work, sometimes it takes 5-6 weeks to gather all of that. Having people come back and forth to a location, it's just too much execution and cost. Right?
Yep. And some people, prefer to know what brand they are using in those situations as well, especially skincare. Because if there's any kind of reaction and those kinds of things, you may want to specifically screen out people that are sensitive to certain things. But the branded in-home can be quite useful.
Yep. Okay, almost finished. Your next slide. The final evaluation. I think that for us and what we're trying to convey here is that there's really no right or wrong way. I think we find devotees of branded and we find a lot more devotees of blinded in many cases. But we believe this is also similar to what Marcia said earlier. This is sometimes related to kind of the division of the company that you're dealing with and the territoriality of like who does what type of work. But looking at all these things kind of in a holistic way of learning is a great way to look at it commercially, but it's really very situational dependent. And Marcia or Ellie, do you have any other comments on that that it really ask the question. I like it when people ask the question of like, this is what we want to learn. What do you think would work well, and how can you consider these things? And we often will even propose several different executions and pricings to see what fits within their budget and what they want to learn. Right?
And I think if you're going out to a store and having consumers buy the products and evaluate them, you can also then look at a very large category. So there was a situation where we were doing some cereal bars, and as many of you would know, there's so much variety nowadays in, let's just say, bars in general. Protein, nut, fruit, chocolate, you name it, right? Performance, not. And we were able to do a mapping across 85 different SKUs in a very short period of time, because the consumers were going out and purchasing products across the United States. And we were able to do that both time effective and cost effective.
Yeah, it completed quite fast. Yeah, the thing I would like to add here is that it really depends on your objective and what you're trying to get out of your research. Maybe the only thing that the only point that we would like to make is that maybe encourage you to do branded when your objective is matching. Like, if the questions you have will be beneficial for a branded study, maybe that's the best way to move forward. So as a summary, every project is unique. It really depends on your objective. Your objectives, we're always there to help you out and have like an individual discussion about your project and your project needs. So if we see branded versus blinded, this a summary slide is that in the branded, we can see the overall consumer experience. We can measure different parts of the journey, from product expectations, shopping experience, preparation and consumption, or product usage and application if it's a non-food product, and then the overall evaluation, like what's the outcome. and if the expectations from the consumers are met or not. When we're doing blinded, we mostly would see either only the consumption or the preparation and the consumption or the usage of the product. Again, it really depends on your objective. If you have prototypes, probably blinded is what you would move forward with. If the product is already there in the market for a few years or a few months, probably branded might be a better option. Marcia, anything to add here?
Nope, I think you covered it beautifully.
Well, we're at time. I really appreciate people's questions as well in the chat. Thank you very much. I think that worked out well because we usually don't have time at the end. And as Ellie and Marcia have mentioned, we're always here to help and happy to evaluate the best opportunity for you in a particular research. We don't, of course, we don't charge anything for exploring that. So if you have an idea or if you have a learning that you're interested in and you want to think about what the best execution is, just let us know. There's our contact information, and we're happy to get on a call and make some proposals of the way in which we might think that would be the best way to do. So, thank you very much, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of the week and weekend.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.